The dust-laden wind stung Rebecca Ward's eyes as she squinted into the horizon, desperately searching for any sign of movement along the tracks that stretched endlessly into the distance. Her heart sank as the final passenger disembarked from the afternoon train, and once again, there was no familiar face among them. This marked the 5th day she had waited at the La Junta, Colorado depot, her trunk stacked beside her like silent monuments to her dwindling hope. The year was 1885, and Rebecca was 22 years old, alone in a frontier town where she knew not a soul. The telegram had been explicit: her uncle would meet her upon arrival to escort her to his ranch after her parents' tragic passing in Philadelphia. But Uncle George was nowhere to be found, and with each passing day, Rebecca's carefully saved funds dwindled at the town's only boarding house. She dabbed at the corners of her eyes with an embroidered handkerchief, determined not to show weakness. The station master had begun to give her pitying glances that made her stomach twist with embarrassment. Her blue traveling dress, once crisp and proper, now hung on her frame, dusty and wrinkled from days of anxious waiting. "Miss, station's closing up for the night." Rebecca nodded absently at the station master's words, gathering her reticule with trembling hands. The weight of her predicament pressed down upon her shoulders as she contemplated spending another night alone at Mrs. Hollister's boarding house, wondering what had become of her only living relative. "You've been waiting here near a week now," the station master continued, his weathered face creased with concern. "Reckon whoever you're waiting for ain't coming." "My uncle sent for me," Rebecca insisted, though her voice lacked the conviction it had held days earlier. "There must have been some misunderstanding. Folks don't always turn up in these parts, miss. Life's unpredictable out west." Rebecca swallowed hard against the lump forming in her throat. She had exhausted all options, sending telegrams to her uncle's address that went unanswered, inquiring about directions to his ranch, only to discover no one seemed familiar with a George Ward in the vicinity. As she gathered herself to leave, a tall figure appeared at the depot entrance, silhouetted against the setting sun. The man's broad shoulders were dusted with the dirt of the trail, his Stetson pulled low over his eyes. He removed his hat as he approached, revealing dark blonde hair and eyes the color of the Colorado sky. "Pardon me, madam," he said, his voice deep and tinged with the accent of the frontier. "I couldn't help overhearing. You're looking for George Ward." Hope fluttered in Rebecca's chest. "Yes, he's my uncle. Do you know him?" The man's expression grew somber. "I'm afraid I bring difficult news, miss." "Ward, Rebecca Ward, Miss Ward," he nodded respectfully. "My name's Wyatt Lawson. I ranch north of town. Your uncle's place bordered mine." His use of the past tense did not escape Rebecca's notice, and her breath caught. There was a flash flood 3 weeks back. George's cabin was right in the path. "I'm sorry to tell you, but he didn't make it." The world seemed to tilt beneath Rebecca's feet. She gripped the edge of the nearby bench to steady herself. "But he sent for me," she whispered. "I received his letter only last month, must have been before," Wyatt said gently. "Word travels slow out here." Rebecca sank onto the bench, her mind reeling. She was alone, truly alone now, in a strange town with dwindling funds and no prospects. Tears welled in her eyes despite her efforts to contain them. "The stage to Denver leaves tomorrow," the station master offered awkwardly. "Could take you back east if you've got the fare." Rebecca's chest tightened. The fare back to Philadelphia would consume what little money she had left, and there was nothing for her there. The family home sold to pay her father's debts, her friends scattered to the homes of relatives. She had come west for a fresh start, to help her uncle with his ranch, and perhaps find a new purpose after losing her parents. "I don't know what I'm going to do," she admitted, her voice barely audible. Wyatt Lawson shifted his weight, hat still in his hands. Something in his steady gaze caught Rebecca's attention, a quiet strength, an earnestness that seemed rare in this rough land. "Miss Ward," he said after a moment of consideration, "I know this isn't proper, but I've been thinking on something since I heard about you waiting here. Your uncle's land is still there. The cabin's gone, but the claim is solid. By rights, it should pass to his next of kin." Rebecca blinked up at him, trying to process his words through her grief. "I've got a foreman's cabin on my spread that's sitting empty," Wyatt continued. "It's modest but sound. You could stay there while you decide what to do about your uncle's property. I'll come for you tomorrow morning if you're agreeable." The station master cleared his throat loudly. "Mr. Lawson, that hardly seems. I'll have my housekeeper, Mrs. Finch, make up the cabin," Wyatt interrupted firmly. "Everything proper and above board. Miss Ward will have her privacy and time to grieve." Rebecca studied the man before her. In Philadelphia, such an offer would be scandalous, but here in this wild territory, different rules seemed to apply. Something about Wyatt Lawson's direct gaze told her he could be trusted, that his offer came from decency rather than ulterior motives. "Why would you help me?" she asked plainly. "You don't know me." A ghost of a smile touched Wyatt's lips. "Your uncle was a good neighbor. Helped me through my first winter out here when I didn't know a stirrup from a saddle horn. I owe him that much." He paused, then added more softly, "Besides, no one should be left waiting with nowhere to go." Rebecca considered her options, which were painfully few. She could spend her remaining money on a ticket back east to face certain poverty, or she could accept this stranger's offer and at least have time to consider her uncle's land. "I'll come for you," Wyatt said again, his words carrying a weight that somehow steadied her. "First light tomorrow if you're at Mrs. Hollister's boarding house." In that moment, with the sun setting over a foreign landscape and her future uncertain, Rebecca made her choice. "I'll be ready," she said, straightening her shoulders. Wyatt nodded, replacing his hat. "First light," he repeated, then turned and walked out of the depot, his spurs jingling softly against the wooden floor. The station master locked the depot behind them as Rebecca made her way back to the boarding house, her mind racing with possibilities and fears. Mrs. Hollister greeted her with the same sympathetic expression she'd worn for days, but this time Rebecca had news to share. "I'll be leaving tomorrow morning," she told the landlady. "Mr. Lawson has offered to help me sort out my uncle's affairs." Mrs. Hollister's eyebrows rose dramatically. "Wyatt Lawson, the rancher from north of town." When Rebecca nodded, the older woman's expression softened. "Well now, he's a good man, that one. Keeps to himself mostly, but fair in his dealings. Lost his wife in childbirth a few years back, along with the baby. Some say that's what brought him out west." Rebecca absorbed this information silently, so he too knew loss. "He said my uncle's land might pass to me," Rebecca ventured. Mrs. Hollister nodded. "That's likely true, though you'll need to speak to Judge Wilson to make it official. Homestead laws out here favor next of kin." That night, Rebecca slept fitfully, her dreams filled with images of flash floods and endless train tracks leading nowhere. When dawn broke, she was already awake, her single trunk repacked and her resolve strengthened. Whatever lay ahead, it had to be better than the helplessness of waiting at the depot for someone who would never come. True to his word, Wyatt Lawson arrived as the first rays of sunlight painted the eastern sky. He drove a sturdy wagon pulled by two well-kept horses, and he tipped his hat to her as she emerged from the boarding house. "Miss Ward," he greeted her, "I hope you're rested." "As well as could be expected," she replied honestly. He nodded, understanding in his eyes, then loaded her trunk into the wagon with ease. After helping her onto the seat, he climbed up beside her, leaving a respectful distance between them. As they pulled away from La Junta, Rebecca cast one last glance at the depot where she had waited so faithfully. A chapter of her life had ended there, the chapter where she believed someone would come for her. Now she was venturing into the unknown with a stranger who had made a simple promise and kept it. The wagon rolled northward along a rutted trail, leaving the small town behind. The landscape opened up around them, vast, golden, and dotted with sagebrush and distant buttes. It was unlike anything Rebecca had ever seen, both terrifying and breathtaking in its vastness. "It's a 3-hour journey to my ranch," Wyatt informed her, his eyes on the trail ahead. "Your uncle's property borders mine to the east. Its good land has a year-round spring that never runs dry." Rebecca tried to imagine owning such a place. In Philadelphia, she had lived in a narrow townhouse with a tiny garden. The concept of land stretching to the horizon, all of it potentially hers, was overwhelming. "I don't know the first thing about ranching," she admitted. Wyatt glanced at her, the morning sun catching in his eyes. "Few do when they first arrive. I certainly didn't. Mrs. Hollister mentioned you came west after." She trailed off, suddenly aware of the personal nature of her comment. Wyatt's hands tightened on the reins, but his voice remained steady. "After my wife and son died, yes, 4 years ago now." "I'm sorry," Rebecca said simply. "I lost my parents 6 months ago, influenza." They shared a moment of silent understanding, two people acquainted with grief. Then Wyatt gestured toward the horizon. "Out here, you can build something new," he said. "The land doesn't care who you were before or what you've lost. It only responds to how you treat it now." As the wagon rolled onward, Rebecca found herself studying her companion's profile. Wyatt Lawson appeared to be in his early 30s, his face weathered by sun and wind, but handsome in a rugged way. His hands on the reins were strong and calloused, a working man's hands, so different from the soft-palmed gentlemen of Philadelphia society. "Tell me about your ranch," she requested, partly from genuine interest and partly to distract herself from her uncertain future. Wyatt seemed to relax slightly. "Started with 20 head of cattle and a run-down cabin 4 years ago. Now I've got over 300 head and a proper house. Took a lot of work and some luck with the weather." He pointed to a distant ridge. "That's the northern boundary. Good grazing land beyond, but I haven't expanded that far yet. And you manage it alone." "Got 3 hired hands, brothers named Dawson who know cattle better than most, and young Jamie who helps with the horses. And Mrs. Finch, who keeps house and cooks. She's a widow from back east, lost her husband at Gettysburg." Rebecca absorbed this information, picturing the small community that awaited her. At least she wouldn't be entirely isolated. "Your uncle mentioned you in his letters," Wyatt said unexpectedly. "Said his niece was educated and had a good head for figures. He was looking forward to having you help with his records." Warmth spread through Rebecca's chest at the thought that her uncle had spoken of her, had valued what she might contribute. "I kept the books for my father's shipping business," she said. It was one of the few ways a woman could be useful in business matters. Wyatt nodded. "That's a rare skill out here. Most ranchers I know can barely write their own names, let alone keep proper accounts." The conversation flowed more easily after that, with Rebecca asking questions about cattle ranching and Wyatt explaining the seasonal rhythms of the work. By the time they stopped to rest the horses at midday, some of Rebecca's anxiety had eased. As Wyatt helped her down from the wagon, his hand strong at her waist, Rebecca caught a glimpse of something in his eyes, a flicker of awareness that reminded her they were a man and woman, not merely two people bound by circumstance. He released her quickly, turning his attention to watering the horses at a small stream. Rebecca smoothed her skirts, her cheeks warm. In Philadelphia, she had received a few gentlemen callers, but none had stirred anything more than polite interest. Here, with this man she barely knew, she felt an unexpected awareness that both confused and intrigued her. They resumed their journey, and by early afternoon a cluster of buildings came into view nestled against a backdrop of rolling hills. Wyatt's ranch was modest by Eastern standards, but substantial for the frontier, a main house built of sturdy logs with a stone chimney, a large barn, several corrals and smaller outbuildings scattered around the property. "This is Broken Spur," Wyatt announced, a note of pride in his voice. "Nothing fancy, but it's mine." "It's impressive," Rebecca replied honestly. "You've built all this in just 4 years, with help," he acknowledged. "And a lot of long days." As they approached, a stout woman with gray-streaked hair emerged from the main house, wiping her hands on her apron. Behind her, 3 men paused in their work to observe the arrival, 2 who looked to be in their 40s with similar features, and a younger man barely out of his teens. "Mrs. Finch," Wyatt called as he brought the wagon to a stop. "This is Miss Rebecca Ward, George's niece." The older woman approached, her expression kind but assessing. "Welcome to Broken Spur, Miss Ward. I've prepared the foreman's cabin for you as Mr. Lawson requested." "Thank you," Rebecca said, suddenly conscious of her travel-worn appearance. "I appreciate your hospitality." "The Dawson brothers, Tom and Frank," Wyatt continued, indicating the older men who touched their hat brims in greeting. "And Jamie Miller." The younger man blushed and ducked his head in an awkward bow that made Rebecca smile despite her fatigue. These were good people. She sensed straightforward and unpretentious in a way that differed markedly from Philadelphia society. Mrs. Finch took charge immediately. "Jamie, help with Miss Ward's trunk. Mr. Lawson, I've got stew on for supper. Miss Ward must be famished after that long journey." Rebecca was indeed hungry, having eaten only a small breakfast at the boarding house. As Wyatt helped her down from the wagon, she felt a momentary dizziness, the culmination of days of anxiety, poor sleep, and the emotional shock of learning about her uncle's death. Wyatt's arm steadied her, concern evident in his face. "You all right? Just tired," she assured him, though in truth she felt overwhelmed by all the changes happening so quickly. The foreman's cabin proved to be a small but well-built structure with 2 rooms, a main living area with a stone fireplace, and a smaller bedroom. Mrs. Finch had indeed prepared it thoroughly, with fresh linens on the bed, a vase of wildflowers on the table, and a fire already crackling in the hearth to ward off the afternoon chill. "It's lovely," Rebecca said sincerely, turning to Mrs. Finch. "Far nicer than I expected." The housekeeper nodded approvingly. "Mr. Lawson insisted it be made comfortable. There's a washstand behind the screen, and I've left some clean towels. Rest a bit, then come to the main house for supper at 6. Left alone, Rebecca sank onto the edge of the bed, finally allowing herself a moment to process everything that had happened. Her uncle was dead. She was stranded in Colorado territory, and yet, against all odds, she had found shelter and kindness. She washed her face and changed into her one remaining clean dress, a simple blue cotton that had survived the journey relatively unwrinkled. As she pinned her hair back into a neat chignon, Rebecca studied her reflection in the small mirror above the washstand. The young woman who gazed back at her looked tired but determined, her green eyes clear and focused. "You can do this," she whispered to herself. "One day at a time." At precisely 6 o'clock, she made her way to the main house, where delicious aromas wafted from the kitchen. Mrs. Finch greeted her warmly and showed her to the dining room, where Wyatt and the 3 ranch hands were already seated. The men rose as she entered, and Wyatt pulled out a chair for her. "Miss Ward, please sit here." Dinner was a simple but hearty affair: beef stew, fresh bread, and apple pie for dessert. The conversation flowed easily around her, with the Dawson brothers discussing cattle prices and Jamie eagerly describing a new foal born the previous week. Rebecca found herself relaxing in their company, occasionally catching Wyatt watching her with an expression she couldn't quite decipher. After the meal, Wyatt suggested they discuss her uncle's property. The ranch hands excused themselves, and Mrs. Finch busied herself with clearing the table, leaving Rebecca and Wyatt seated by the fireplace in the main room. "Your uncle's land is about 500 acres, Wyatt explained, unfolding a rough map on the table between them. "Good water rights, decent grazing. The cabin's gone, but the barn was on higher ground and survived." Rebecca studied the map, trying to envision the property. What would something like this be worth? Wyatt considered. Hard to say exactly. Land prices are rising with the railroad coming through. Maybe $2,000 for the land itself, more if you count the water rights. Of course, without structures, it's not as valuable. $2,000 was a substantial sum, enough for Rebecca to return east and establish herself comfortably, if that was what she wanted. The realization that she had options brought a sense of relief. "I'll take you to see it tomorrow if you'd like," Wyatt offered. "And we should ride into town soon to speak with Judge Wilson about establishing your claim." "Thank you," Rebecca said, meeting his gaze directly. "You've been extraordinarily kind to a stranger." Something flickered in Wyatt's eyes, a warmth that made her heart beat a little faster. "Not entirely a stranger," he said quietly. "George spoke of you often, said you had courage." "I'm not sure that's true," Rebecca admitted. "I've been terrified since the moment I realized no one was coming for me at the depot." "Courage isn't about not feeling fear," Wyatt said, his voice low and earnest. "It's about facing it and moving forward anyway. You've done that." Their eyes held for a long moment, and Rebecca felt something shift between them, a recognition, perhaps, of shared understanding. Then Wyatt cleared his throat and stood. "It's getting late. I'll walk you back to your cabin." The night air was cool, with a canopy of stars overhead unlike anything Rebecca had seen in Philadelphia. As they walked the short distance to the foreman's cabin, their boots crunching on the gravel path, Rebecca felt a curious sense of rightness despite all the upheaval. At her door, Wyatt paused. "We'll head out to your uncle's place after breakfast around 8. That suit you?" Rebecca nodded. "That would be fine." "Sleep well, Miss Ward," he said, touching the brim of his hat before turning to leave. "Mr. Lawson," she called after him, causing him to look back. "You kept your word. You said you'd come for me, and you did." A slow smile spread across his face, transforming his features. "I don't make promises lightly, Miss Ward." As Rebecca settled into the unfamiliar bed that night, listening to the distant lowing of cattle and the soft whisper of wind through the pines, she reflected on the strange twists of fate that had brought her to this place. She had lost so much: her parents, her uncle, her home, and yet here, in this remote corner of Colorado territory, she sensed the possibility of something new beginning. Morning brought clear skies and a refreshing crispness to the air. Rebecca awoke feeling more rested than she had in weeks. The weight of uncertainty lifted somewhat from her shoulders. She dressed in her most practical outfit, a sturdy brown skirt and white shirtwaist, and pinned her auburn hair securely beneath a modest hat. Mrs. Finch had breakfast waiting in the main house: eggs, bacon, biscuits, and strong coffee that revived Rebecca's spirits further. Wyatt joined them shortly, freshly shaven and wearing a clean blue shirt that brought out the color of his eyes. "Morning, Miss Ward," he greeted her, his voice carrying a warmth that hadn't been there the previous day. "Sleep well." Better than I have in quite some time, she admitted. Your foreman's cabin is quite comfortable. Mrs. Finch beamed at this praise of her preparations. I've packed a lunch for you both. No telling how long you'll be at George's place. After breakfast, Wyatt surprised Rebecca by leading her not to the wagon but to the corral where a gentle-looking bay mare waited, already saddled. I thought we might ride, he explained. It's easier to see the boundaries of the property on horseback. He must have noticed her hesitation, for he added, unless you'd prefer the wagon. Rebecca straightened her shoulders. I can ride. It's been some time, but my father kept horses in Philadelphia. Wyatt nodded approvingly. This is Daisy. She's steady and patient. He helped Rebecca mount, his hands strong and sure at her waist. The side saddle was different from what she was accustomed to, but Daisy stood perfectly still as Rebecca arranged her skirts and found her balance. Wyatt swung easily onto his own mount, a tall chestnut gelding with a white blaze. Ready, they rode eastward from the ranch house, following a well-worn trail that wound through stands of pine and across open meadows. Rebecca quickly adjusted to Daisy's smooth gait, finding unexpected pleasure in the freedom of horseback travel. Your uncle's property starts just beyond that ridge, Wyatt explained, pointing ahead. The boundary runs along Pine Creek, then east to the rock formation locals call the Devil's Backbone, and south to Cottonwood Draw. They crested the ridge, and Rebecca drew in a sharp breath at the vista below. A verdant valley spread before them, bisected by a clear stream fringed with cottonwoods and willows. In the distance, cattle grazed peacefully on the abundant grass. It's beautiful, she whispered, suddenly understanding her uncle's decision to settle in this wild land. Best grazing land in the county, Wyatt agreed. Your uncle knew what he was doing when he staked his claim. They rode down into the valley, Wyatt pointing out landmarks and explaining the seasonal patterns of ranching in this region. Near the stream, the charred remains of a cabin stood as mute testimony to the flash flood that had taken George Ward's life. Rebecca dismounted to examine the site, her heart heavy with the finality of her uncle's passing. Among the debris, she found a metal box, its contents protected from the elements. Inside were land deeds, a few letters, and a daguerreotype of her mother as a young woman. This belonged to my mother, she said softly, showing Wyatt the image. She and Uncle George were close before she married my father. Wyatt studied the picture respectfully. You have her eyes, he observed. Rebecca looked up at him in surprise, touched that he had noticed such a detail. Their gazes held for a moment, and she became acutely aware of how alone they were in this vast landscape. Wyatt cleared his throat and turned his attention to the barn, which stood intact on higher ground. Structure's sound, he commented, changing the subject. Could serve as temporary shelter if you decided to rebuild. The implication of his words hung in the air between them. If she decided to rebuild. If she stayed. I haven't decided anything yet, Rebecca said carefully, replacing the items in the metal box. Wyatt nodded, his expression unreadable. No need to rush. These decisions take time. They spent the remainder of the morning exploring the property, with Wyatt explaining its features and potential with the expertise of someone who knew the land intimately. At midday, they stopped beside the stream for the lunch Mrs. Finch had prepared: cold chicken, bread, cheese, and apple tarts that made Rebecca close her eyes in appreciation. Mrs. Finch is a treasure, she commented, savoring the tart's flaky crust. She is, Wyatt agreed. Came west after losing her husband, looking for purpose. Found it keeping a bunch of cowboys fed and somewhat civilized. He hesitated, then added, people find their way here for all sorts of reasons. Loss, hope, sometimes both. And what brought you here? Rebecca asked, Though she already knew part of the answer, Wyatt's gaze drifted to the horizon. After Caroline and the baby died, there was nothing left for me in Boston. My father wanted me to continue in the family banking business, but I couldn't breathe there anymore. He picked up a stone and skipped it across the water. Came west with no plan except to get away. Found this land, and something inside me recognized it as home. I understand that feeling of needing to escape, Rebecca said softly. After my parents died, our home felt like a tomb. Every corner held memories that were too painful to face. Wyatt studied her, his blue eyes thoughtful. And now, what does your heart tell you to do about this land? Rebecca considered the question seriously, gazing out over the peaceful valley that could be hers. I don't know yet, she admitted. It's beautiful and I can see why Uncle George loved it, but ranching is utterly foreign to me. You could sell, Wyatt suggested, though something in his tone suggested he hoped she wouldn't. Take the money and start fresh somewhere else. Denver, perhaps, or even back east. The thought should have been appealing financial security, a return to familiar surroundings. Yet Rebecca found herself reluctant to embrace that option. There was something about this wild land that called to her, despite its hardships. I need time, she said finally, to learn more about the land, about ranching, to decide if I could make a life here. Wyatt nodded, satisfaction evident in his expression. Fair enough. No one should rush a decision this important. He rose and offered his hand to help her up. We should head back if we want to reach the ranch before dark. As they mounted their horses and turned toward Broken Spur, Rebecca cast one last glance at her uncle's property, her property now, if she chose to claim it. The afternoon sun gilded the landscape, making the grass shimmer like spun gold and the stream sparkle like diamonds. It was harsh country, yes, but also beautiful beyond words. The return journey passed pleasantly, with Wyatt pointing out wildlife and plants of interest. Rebecca found herself laughing at his stories of his early, inept attempts at ranching, tales of calves born in snowstorms, and his first disastrous attempt to break a wild horse. You make it sound as though you were completely hopeless, she teased. Wyatt grinned, the expression transforming his usually serious face. I was. Your uncle saved me from myself more times than I can count. Taught me to read the weather, to know when cattle were sickening before they showed obvious signs. He had an instinct for the land. Tell me more about him, Rebecca requested. Our correspondence was regular but brief. I feel as though I barely knew him. For the remainder of the ride, Wyatt shared stories about George Ward, his generosity during hard times, his uncanny ability to find water where others saw only desert, his habit of reciting Shakespeare to his cattle on quiet nights. With each anecdote, Rebecca's uncle became more real to her, and her sense of loss deepened even as her appreciation for the man grew. They arrived back at Broken Spur as the sun was setting, painting the western sky in spectacular hues of orange, pink, and purple. Mrs. Finch had supper waiting, and the evening passed in comfortable conversation around the dining table. Over the next week, a routine developed. Rebecca spent her mornings with Mrs. Finch, learning the practical aspects of frontier housekeeping, how to maintain a garden in the arid climate, preserve food for winter, and make do with limited supplies. In the afternoons, Wyatt would take her riding around the properties, teaching her about cattle ranching and the particular challenges and rewards of life in this remote territory. On the third day, they rode into La Junta to meet with Judge Wilson about Rebecca's inheritance. The judge, a silver-haired man with kind eyes and a no-nonsense manner, confirmed that, as George Ward's only living relative, Rebecca was indeed entitled to his property. The paperwork's straightforward, he told her, shuffling through the documents on his desk. Sign here, and the land is legally yours. Of course, what you choose to do with it is entirely up to you." Rebecca's hand trembled slightly as she signed her name, the magnitude of the moment not lost on her. She was now a landowner, a woman of property in a territory where such status was rare. "Congratulations, Miss Ward," Wyatt said quietly as they left the judge's office. "You're officially a Colorado landowner." Rebecca smiled, feeling a curious mixture of excitement and trepidation. "It doesn't quite seem real." "Oh, it'll feel real enough when the taxes come due," Wyatt replied with a chuckle, then grew more serious. "Have you given any thought to your plans?" Rebecca hesitated. In truth, she had been thinking of little else, but her thoughts remained conflicted. "I'm still considering my options," she said carefully. They stopped at the general store before leaving town, where Rebecca purchased fabric for new dresses and some personal items. Mrs. Hollister spotted them as they were loading their purchases into the wagon and hurried over, curiosity evident in her expression. "Miss Ward, how wonderful to see you settling in," the landlady exclaimed, her eyes darting between Rebecca and Wyatt with undisguised interest. "And Mr. Lawson, so good of you to take our stranded visitor under your wing." Wyatt tipped his hat politely but said little, clearly uncomfortable with the woman's barely concealed insinuations. Rebecca, however, met Mrs. Hollister's gaze directly. "Mr. Lawson has been a perfect gentleman," she stated firmly. "I'm staying in his foreman's cabin while I decide what to do about my uncle's property." Mrs. Hollister's eyebrows rose. "Oh, I'm sure he has been, dear. It's just that people do talk, you understand." A young, unmarried woman staying at a bachelor's ranch. Rebecca felt heat rise to her cheeks, but before she could respond, Wyatt stepped forward. "Miss Ward is under the protection of my entire household," he said, his voice carrying a quiet authority that seemed to deflate Mrs. Hollister's enthusiasm for gossip. "Mrs. Finch acts as chaperone, and Miss Ward's reputation remains as impeccable as when she arrived in La Junta." The landlady had the grace to look abashed. "Of course, Mr. Lawson. I meant no offense." On the journey back to the ranch, Rebecca remained unusually quiet, Mrs. Hollister's comments having unsettled her more than she cared to admit. She had been raised to be conscious of propriety, and the realization that her current living arrangement might be the subject of town gossip was disturbing. Wyatt seemed to sense her discomfort. "Don't let Mrs. Hollister trouble you," he said eventually. "Frontier towns run on gossip, but it rarely amounts to anything." "Nevertheless, she raised a valid point," Rebecca replied. "I cannot impose on your hospitality indefinitely. I need to make decisions about my future." Wyatt's hands tightened on the reins. "You're not imposing," he said firmly. "Your presence has been welcome." Something in his tone made Rebecca glance at him sharply. There was a tension in his profile that hadn't been there before, a carefully controlled emotion that intrigued her. "Still," she persisted, "I must consider what's proper." "What's proper," Wyatt said quietly, "is what brings you peace and security. The rest is just noise." His words stayed with Rebecca long after they returned to Broken Spur. That evening, as she sat in her cabin mending a tear in her skirt, she found herself reflecting on the 2 weeks that had passed since her arrival. The initial strangeness had faded, replaced by a growing comfort with the rhythms of ranch life. Mrs. Finch had become a friend and mentor. The ranch hands treated her with respectful friendliness. And Wyatt. Wyatt was becoming something she wasn't ready to name, a presence in her life that she found herself increasingly unwilling to relinquish. The next morning, Rebecca rose early and walked to the main house, finding Mrs. Finch already busy preparing breakfast. "You're up with the roosters today," the housekeeper observed, handing her a cup of coffee. "I couldn't sleep," Rebecca admitted. "I've been thinking about my situation." Mrs. Finch nodded knowingly. "Coming to a decision, are you, perhaps?" Rebecca hesitated, then plunged ahead. "Mrs. Finch, may I ask you something personal, of course, dear? Do you ever regret coming west? After losing your husband, I mean. Wouldn't it have been easier to stay in familiar surroundings?" The older woman's hand stilled on the biscuit dough she was kneading. "Easier, yes," she said thoughtfully, "but not better. Back east, I was just another widow, pitied and gradually forgotten. Here I'm needed. Mr. Lawson and the boys would likely starve without me." She smiled wryly. "There's dignity in being necessary." Rebecca nodded, understanding completely. In Philadelphia, she too would have been relegated to the margins, a spinster dependent on the charity of distant relatives, or forced into a marriage of convenience. Here, despite the challenges, there was the possibility of building something of her own. "I think I'd like to try," she said softly, almost to herself. "To make a go of the ranch, I mean, not sell it." Mrs. Finch's face broke into a broad smile. "I had a feeling you might," she said, patting Rebecca's hand. "You've got pioneer spirit, whether you knew it or not." When Wyatt came in for breakfast, Rebecca asked if they might speak privately afterward. He agreed readily, a flicker of concern crossing his features. They walked to the corral where Jamie was exercising one of the horses. The morning air was crisp, with the scent of pine carried on the breeze. "I've made a decision," Rebecca began, her heart beating rapidly despite her outward calm. "I want to stay and develop my uncle's land." Wyatt's expression remained carefully neutral. "You're sure it won't be easy?" "I'm aware of the challenges," Rebecca replied. "But I believe it's what Uncle George would have wanted, and more importantly, I think it's what I want." A slow smile spread across Wyatt's face. "I was hoping you'd say that," he admitted. "Your uncle's land is too good to sell to strangers who might not care for it properly." "Of course I'll need help," Rebecca continued, warming to her plan. "I thought perhaps I could start small, rebuild the cabin, acquire a modest herd, learn as I go." Wyatt nodded, enthusiasm evident in his eyes. "That's sensible. We can ride over tomorrow and start planning where to rebuild. The original site is vulnerable to flooding, but there's higher ground near the old barn that would work well." His immediate support bolstered Rebecca's confidence. "There's one other thing," she added. "Mrs. Hollister wasn't entirely wrong yesterday. My continued residence at your ranch could eventually cause talk that might damage both our reputations." Wyatt's expression sobered. "What are you suggesting?" "I thought perhaps I could stay in town while the cabin is being built. It would be more proper." "Absolutely not," Wyatt said firmly, surprising her with his vehemence. "La Junta's no place for a woman alone. You're safer here, regardless of gossip." Rebecca was taken aback by his intensity. "I can take care of myself, Mr. Lawson." "I don't doubt that," he said, softening his tone. "But there's no need to subject yourself to discomfort and potential danger when you have a perfectly good cabin here." He hesitated, then added more quietly, "Unless you're uncomfortable with the arrangement." "No," Rebecca admitted. "I've been very comfortable here." "It's just—" "Then stay," he interrupted. "At least until your own place is habitable. Mrs. Finch provides all the propriety needed, and anyone who suggests otherwise will answer to me." The possessive note in his voice sent an unexpected thrill through Rebecca. "Very well," she agreed. "Until my cabin is built." Over the next few weeks, Rebecca threw herself into the project of rebuilding on her property. Wyatt proved an invaluable ally, helping her hire local men for construction and advising her on everything from the placement of windows to the depth of the well. The Dawson brothers lent their expertise on pasture management. And even young, Jamie contributed by breaking a gentle mare for Rebecca's personal use. As summer progressed into early autumn, Rebecca found herself increasingly at home in this rugged territory. Her skin bronzed from hours outdoors, her hands toughened from work, and her understanding of ranching grew daily. The cabin on her property took shape, a sturdy two-room structure with a stone fireplace and proper windows ordered from Denver. Through it all, her relationship with Wyatt evolved in subtle ways. Their conversations deepened, touching on hopes and dreams, fears and regrets. She learned about his childhood in Boston, his brief, happy marriage to Caroline, and his struggle to find purpose after her death. In turn, she shared stories of her parents, her education, and her secret ambition to someday write stories about the West for Eastern publications. One evening, as they sat on the porch of the main house watching the sunset paint the sky in spectacular hues, Rebecca realized with sudden clarity that she had fallen in love with Wyatt Lawson. The recognition both thrilled and terrified her. He had been unfailingly kind and supportive, but he had given no clear indication that his feelings matched the intensity of hers. "Penny for your thoughts," Wyatt said, breaking into her reverie. Rebecca smiled, not quite meeting his eyes. "I was just thinking how different my life is now from what I expected when I arrived at the depot in La Junta." "Disappointed?" he asked, a hint of uncertainty in his voice. "No," she replied honestly. "Surprised, perhaps, but not disappointed." Wyatt seemed about to say more when Mrs. Finch called them in for supper. The moment lost. The following day, disaster struck. Rebecca was at her property overseeing the final touches on her cabin when dark clouds began gathering on the horizon. The workers exchanged worried glances, packing up their tools earlier than usual. "Storm's coming, Miss Ward," the foreman explained. "Might be a bad one. You should head back to Broken Spur before it hits." Rebecca glanced at the sky, noting how quickly the clouds were advancing. "I think you're right. Will the cabin be secure? We've battened everything down." "It'll weather the storm fine." She mounted her mare and started back toward Wyatt's ranch, but the storm moved faster than she anticipated. Halfway there, the skies opened, releasing a deluge that quickly turned the trail to mud. Lightning flashed dangerously close, followed immediately by deafening thunder that spooked her horse. The mare reared, nearly unseating Rebecca. She managed to stay mounted but lost control as the frightened animal bolted off the trail into the woods. Branches whipped at her face and she ducked low over the horse's neck, trying desperately to regain control. Suddenly, the ground seemed to disappear beneath them. The mare stumbled on the edge of a washed-out gully, sending Rebecca flying from the saddle. She hit the ground hard, pain exploding in her ankle as she tumbled down the steep embankment. When she came to rest at the bottom, Rebecca found herself in a precarious position. The gully was rapidly filling with rainwater, threatening to sweep her away if she didn't move quickly. But when she tried to stand, her ankle gave way beneath her, sending fresh waves of pain up her leg. "Help!" she cried, though the storm swallowed her voice. Her horse had disappeared, likely heading back to Broken Spur, but there was no guarantee anyone would notice its riderless return in the chaos of the storm. Using a fallen branch as a makeshift crutch, Rebecca managed to drag herself to slightly higher ground, but the rising water and her inability to climb the steep walls of the gully left her in grave danger. The rain continued relentlessly, soaking her to the skin and chilling her to the bone. As darkness fell, compounding her predicament, Rebecca fought against despair. She had survived the loss of her parents, the discovery of her uncle's death, and the challenges of starting a new life in the West. She refused to perish in a rain-swollen gully when her future finally seemed bright with promise. Hours passed, each minute an eternity of cold, pain, and mounting fear. The water continued to rise, now reaching her waist as she clung to an exposed tree root. Her strength was failing, her grip weakening with each passing moment. Then, through the roar of the storm, she heard the distant sound of her name being called. "Rebecca! Rebecca, where are you?" "Here," she screamed, summoning her remaining strength. "I'm down here." A lantern appeared at the edge of the gully, its light catching on a familiar face wild with concern. "Rebecca!" Wyatt shouted, relief and fear mingling in his voice. "The water's rising," she called back. "I can't climb out." "My ankle, hold on," he ordered, already securing a rope to a nearby tree. "I'm coming down." Moments later, Wyatt was beside her in the churning water, his strong arms encircling her waist. "I've got you," he said fiercely. "I won't let you go." With remarkable strength, he lifted her so she could grasp the rope, then supported her weight as they began the arduous climb to safety. Rebecca's injured ankle made the ascent agonizing, but Wyatt's steady presence gave her the courage to continue. When they finally reached the top, Wyatt pulled her well away from the edge before gathering her into his arms, his body shaking with emotion. "I thought I'd lost you," he murmured into her wet hair, "when your horse came back without you. How did you find me?" Rebecca asked, her teeth chattering from cold and shock. "I knew the trails you usually take," he replied, already removing his oilskin coat to wrap around her. "When the storm hit, I kept thinking about you out here alone. Then when your mare returned riderless." His voice broke. "I've been searching for hours." The raw emotion in his voice touched Rebecca deeply. "You came for me," she whispered. Wyatt's hands framed her face, his eyes intense even in the dim lantern light. "I will always come for you, Rebecca. Always." Then his lips were on hers, warm despite the rain still pouring around them, urgent with a passion that matched the storm. Rebecca responded instinctively, her arms circling his neck, her heart soaring with the confirmation of feelings too long unspoken. When they finally broke apart, Wyatt rested his forehead against hers. "I love you," he said simply. "I think I have since I first saw you waiting at that depot, so determined despite your fear." "I love you too," Rebecca replied, the words bringing a profound sense of rightness. "I wasn't sure if you felt the same." His laugh was soft and wondering. "How could I not? You've brought life back to a heart I thought was dead." Despite the continuing storm, the cold, and her injured ankle, Rebecca felt a warmth spreading through her that no rain could extinguish. They had found each other against impossible odds, two souls healing from loss and finding new purpose together. Wyatt lifted her carefully, mindful of her injury. "Let's get you home," he said, carrying her to where his horse waited patiently in the rain. "Mrs. Finch will have my hide for letting you catch your death out here." "Home," Rebecca repeated, the word holding new meaning. "Yes, let's go home." The following weeks passed in a blur of recovery and revelation. Rebecca's ankle, while sprained, was not broken, though Mrs. Finch confined her to bed for several days with stern warnings about the dangers of pneumonia. Wyatt visited constantly, sometimes bringing work to discuss, sometimes simply sitting beside her, reading aloud from one of the few books in his modest library. By the time Rebecca was able to move about freely again, her cabin was complete a snug, well-built home waiting for her to claim it. Yet the prospect of leaving Broken Spur, of no longer seeing Wyatt each morning at breakfast or sharing the evening meal with him, filled her with unexpected sadness. On the day she was to move to her own property, Rebecca stood in the foreman's cabin, packing her belongings with a heavy heart. A knock at the door revealed Wyatt, his expression unusually solemn. "May I come in?" he asked. Rebecca nodded, setting aside the dress she'd been folding. "Of course." Wyatt entered, removing his hat and turning it nervously in his hands, a gesture so uncharacteristic that it immediately caught Rebecca's attention. "I've been thinking," he began, then stopped, seeming to gather his thoughts. "About," she prompted gently, "about your cabin being finished. About you leaving Broken Spur." He set his hat aside and moved closer, taking her hands in his. "Rebecca, I don't want you to go." Her heart quickened. "What are you saying, Wyatt?" "I'm saying this poorly," he admitted with a rueful smile. "What I mean is," he took a deep breath, "I love you, Rebecca Ward. These past months have shown me that life has second chances, that happiness is possible even after loss. If you feel as I do, I'm asking you to stay. Not as my guest, but as my wife." Joy surged through Rebecca, bright and overwhelming. "Are you certain?" "Your life was settled before I arrived. I wouldn't want you to feel obligated because of what happened during the storm." "Obligated," Wyatt repeated incredulously. "Rebecca, you've brought light back into my world. Every day with you makes me want a lifetime more." His blue eyes searched hers earnestly. "I'm asking because I love you, because the thought of waking up without you near is unbearable." Tears of happiness filled Rebecca's eyes. "Then my answer is yes," she said. "I love you, and nothing would make me happier than becoming your wife." Wyatt's face transformed with joy as he pulled her into his arms, his kiss conveying all the emotion words couldn't express. When they finally separated, both breathless and smiling, he reached into his pocket and withdrew a small velvet box. "This was my mother's," he explained, opening it to reveal a delicate gold ring set with a single pearl. "She gave it to me before I left Boston, said I might find someone worthy of it someday. She was right." As he slipped the ring onto her finger, Rebecca felt the final pieces of her new life falling perfectly into place. "It's beautiful," she said softly. "I'll treasure it always." They were married 2 weeks later in the small church in La Junta, with Mrs. Finch, the Dawson brothers, and Jamie Miller as their only guests. Judge Wilson performed the ceremony, his kind eyes twinkling as Wyatt and Rebecca exchanged their vows. The celebration afterward at Broken Spur was modest but joyful, with Mrs. Finch outdoing herself preparing a feast that would have impressed even the finest Philadelphia hostess. As the evening progressed, Rebecca found herself on the porch with Wyatt, watching the stars emerge in the vast Colorado sky. "Happy?" he asked, his arm warm around her shoulders. "Completely," she replied, leaning into his embrace. "I never imagined when I was waiting at that depot that my life would take such a turn." "Sometimes the best journeys are the ones we never planned," Wyatt observed, pressing a kiss to her temple. Later that night, in the privacy of what was now their bedroom in the main house, Rebecca discovered the depth of Wyatt's love as they came together as husband and wife. His touch was tender yet passionate, his whispered endearments making her feel cherished and desired in equal measure. In his arms, she found a belonging she had never known was possible. As autumn gave way to winter, Rebecca and Wyatt worked together to combine their properties, creating a ranch twice the size of Broken Spur. They decided to maintain both houses, the main ranch house for themselves, and Rebecca's newly built cabin for Mrs. Finch, who had long deserved a place of her own. Their first Christmas as a married couple was celebrated with simple gifts and abundant love. Rebecca gave Wyatt a finely crafted leather-bound journal for recording ranch business, while he surprised her with a beautiful desk where she could pursue her writing ambitions. "I've been thinking," Rebecca said that evening as they sat before the fire, a blanket shared between them. "My uncle's land needs a name of its own." Wyatt considered this. "What did you have in mind?" "Promised Land," she suggested, "because it represents a promise kept, a new beginning." Wyatt's eyes softened with understanding. "Promised Land it is," he agreed, pulling her closer against the winter chill outside. When spring arrived, bringing new calves and the vibrant rebirth of the range eland, Rebecca discovered she was expecting their first child. The news filled Wyatt with a mixture of joy and apprehension given his past loss, but Rebecca's calm confidence gradually eased his fears. "This child will be strong like its father," she assured him, guiding his hand to her still flat stomach. "And stubborn like its mother, a true Westerner." As her pregnancy progressed, Rebecca continued to be actively involved in ranch operations, much to the admiration of the hands. She kept the books with meticulous precision, wrote articles about frontier life that found publication in Eastern newspapers, and even began a modest school for the children of neighboring ranchers who had no access to formal education. Their son, George William Lawson, was born on a crisp autumn day as the aspens turned gold on the hillsides. With Mrs. Finch's experienced assistance and Wyatt's steadfast support, Rebecca delivered a healthy, robust boy whose lusty cries announced his arrival to the world. When the midwife placed the infant in Wyatt's arms, Rebecca saw tears in her husband's eyes, tears of joy, of healing, of gratitude for this second chance at fatherhood. "He's perfect," Wyatt whispered, carefully placing their son in Rebecca's waiting arms, "just like his mother." As young George grew, so did the ranch's prosperity. Wyatt's knowledge of cattle and Rebecca's head for business proved a formidable combination. By their 5th anniversary, Broken Spur had become one of the most successful operations in the county, with the Lawsons respected not only for their ranching acumen, but also for their generosity during hard times. Their family expanded again with the birth of twins Elizabeth Caroline and James Thomas, bringing even more joy to their already blessed life. The main house grew as well, with additional rooms built to accommodate their growing family and the occasional guests, who now regularly visited from back east. One spring evening, 10 years after Rebecca had first arrived in La Junta, she and Wyatt sat on the porch swing watching their children play in the yard. Young George, now 9, supervised his 5-year-old siblings as they attempted to lasso a practice dummy Wyatt had set up. "Do you ever regret it?" Wyatt asked suddenly. "Staying here instead of returning east?" Rebecca turned to him, surprised by the question. "Never," she said firmly. "Not for a single moment. Even during that first winter when the blizzard nearly buried the house. Or when the drought almost ruined us 3 years ago." Rebecca smiled, understanding his need for reassurance even after all these years. "Those challenges only made us stronger, proved what we could accomplish together." She took his hand, her fingers tracing the calluses earned through years of honest work. "This is where I belong, Wyatt. With you, with our children, on this land we've built together." Wyatt's expression softened as he pulled her closer. "I thank God every day that you waited at that depot," he murmured, "that I found the courage to speak to you. And I thank God you kept your promise," Rebecca replied, "that you came for me when no one else did." As the sun set over the Colorado plains, painting the sky in glorious hues that still took Rebecca's breath away even after a decade, she reflected on the strange twist of fate that had brought her to this place. What had begun as disappointment and fear at a dusty depot had transformed into a life richer and more fulfilling than anything she could have imagined. The children's laughter rang out across the yard, mingling with the lowing of cattle in the distance and the soft rustle of wind through the cottonwoods. These were the sounds of home, of belonging, of a promise not just kept, but continually renewed with each passing day. Wyatt's arm tightened around her shoulders as though he could read her thoughts. "I love you, Rebecca Lawson," he said simply, "more with each passing year." "And I love you," she replied, resting her head against his shoulder as the first stars appeared in the twilight sky. Forever and always. Together they watched as their children abandoned their game and raced toward the house, faces alight with the boundless energy of youth. Their voices called out in unison, "Papa! Mama! Come see what we found!" Wyatt rose and offered his hand to Rebecca with a smile that still made her heart skip a beat. "Shall we, Mrs. Lawson?" Rebecca took his hand, feeling the same certainty she had felt that stormy night when he had found her in the gully, that with this man beside her, she could face any challenge, overcome any obstacle, and find joy in the journey they shared. "Lead the way, Mr. Lawson," she said, following him toward their children and whatever new adventure awaited them on the land that had become their promise, their legacy, their home. As they walked together across the yard they had built from nothing but hope and hard work, Rebecca knew with absolute certainty that the long, anxious days she had spent waiting at the depot had led her precisely where she was meant to be. What had seemed like abandonment had in truth been the beginning of the most beautiful journey of her life, a journey that continued to unfold with each new day on the frontier they both now called home.